Welcome to the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast, the show that takes you on a journey of exploration. We'll discuss tried and true methods alongside the latest trends of how to best live your life to its fullest and happiest. From psychology to meditation, science to self-help books, the GSMC Life and Happiness Podcast will help you to discover what makes you happy and how you can live life being the best you possible.
Hello and welcome back to the Life and Happiness Podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano. Happy Tuesday, everyone. Hope you're all doing well. What's the most interesting thing that's been going on in the news this week? Well, states are starting to open up. California is becoming more open as it used to be, and we're already over a year of the 2 weeks to slow the spread. How have you guys dealt with this year? For some, it's been easy, and others, it's been incredibly hard. I wonder what all of your stories are. Through my work, I'm actually able to talk to different families every day, and, it's heartbreaking to hear some of the trials and tribulations people have been through. But, people are strong. People work through, people find a way. And now that things are starting to get back to some semblance of normal, well, hopefully, everyone can get back to the level that they were at before, and maybe even greater heights. So, question of the day, and this actually comes as a recent story, a recent event that happened a few days ago. What do you guys think of masks? And not in efficacy, I'm talking about more how they relate to people in, recognizing them in their faces. One person that I like to listen to, Dennis Prager, puts it, is that it almost dehumanizes them because you can't really recognize who they are anymore. You miss the little facial cues, the way they have their lips oriented, the smile, or other things. Because depending on the type of mask someone uses, it can either be covering just the tip of the nose and where the mouth is, or everything below their eyes, completely. So then you lose all sense of the identity of that person. Think about it why do you think superheroes and burglars and all these shows wear masks? Is to conceal their identity, right? And the reason why I came to thinking about this is because I like to chat to people. I like to get to know them a little bit if I'm just randomly going out to the market or something like that. And there was a girl that I talked to who was at the register 2 weeks ago. And, she was there at last week when I came in. And, she remembered the conversation, but she didn't recognize me instantly because, masks. And, because you see, it's not just that you see so many people. It's that now by putting that barrier there, it's everyone almost looks the same. There's less uniqueness to every single person because you're missing about, at least 40% of them. And that depends how big their head is. So, I'm curious, what do you guys think? Does it dehumanize people? Does it help? I don't know. Yeah, I'm just wondering what your thoughts are on all that. So, what's the plan for today? So, today I want to discuss a little bit more of freedom of coercion. The idea that I introduced last episode. Because what I was touching on is, I think worldview matters. I think the way you look at the world, the lens of which you view the world affects how you live life and affects your mood as well. So that would include happiness. And I started last episode was a contrast of what freedom of cost entails and what freedom of coercion is, and why I think freedom of cost steers you the wrong way. But now I'm going to kind of go more specific examples of what your own worldview does for yourself. And also, I don't think I did freedom of coercion justice, because it's an intensely complicated idea. And just think about it. What in the world tells you you have a right to be free from the bullying of others? By that I mean them trying to impose their will over you by physical force or threat of physical force. What in this world tells us that we have that? Who came up with that idea? How did they come up with that idea? Because it's in this context, it's not just you have a right, it's that I also have a duty to not impose my will over you through physical force and threat of physical force. It's a converse thing. It's your rights are my duties. You don't have those rights unless I fulfill my duties. Because if I ignore my duty and just impose my will over others in that way, I act in those bullies that are in the schoolyards, well, also in other places too, then your rights don't really matter, right? It's like, if someone is holding a gun to your head, and they're telling you to say exactly what they want you to say. Think 1984, actually. 1984 is a perfect example. I'm sure you've all heard the book, but if I want to explain it all to you a little bit, it's more like the society as it's built is forcing everyone to think the same way. And the main character refuses this entire time until they break him at the end, using his largest fears. And it's the whole idea of freedom coercion is saying that whole event should not happen at all. That we are obligated to not act in that manner because people have the right to be free from that. And who came up with that? Like, who? Also, when in history have we listened to that? Because it's incredibly rare. Every nation across history has been plagued by slavery. Nearly every nation in history has been one ruled by a king, and the king's will was the law. And there are many examples, just authoritarian regimes, where there is no room for freedom in that sense. So I want to expound more on that in the later segments, and explain more of how we came up to the idea. And the final segment today would be the 7 ways that our worldview shapes us. That's going to be what that segment is, because it's incredibly, the way it's been explained to me. It's not just a biology thing, and it's not just it's not just a values thing. It's both of them intertwined. Because, here's the easiest example. Are you the glass is half full or is half empty type of person? Because both are true. In that specific context, both are true. That's not always the case, but your perspective shows the values of which you're putting onto the cup. So, one would lead to you being more optimistic, or one seems to be like you're more pessimistic. Maybe that's not the best indicator of those kinds of things, but it's the typical example that people use, the glass half full type person or glass half empty type of person. So, to be more specific to kind of that, I think I've elaborated on this a little bit before with the idea of is life itself a gift or is it a curse? And how dramatically that perspective shifts. Because if you're starting out with the idea that, life is a gift, life is a blessing, it's honest to God goodness that we're here, even though that life itself is suffering, because it's true. The only things guaranteed in life are suffering and death. Think about it. Well, before all this technology, what were human lives like? You were born, you probably would not have survived childbirth, and your mom likely would have died in childbirth. And your dad protect you as try as he might. One cut, one wound gets infected, and he passes away at 25. And then you're fending for yourself, and you think the environment's cold. There's really nothing to do but kind of sit around. It's not pleasant. And then you're also dealing with the fact that you need food, you need water, you need protection from the elements and the wildlife. Like there's the base state, remove all the technology, all the advancements that we have to make life easier. Like if we look at animals, wild animals, it's not like they live pleasant lives. They live day to day for whatever their needs are. And this presupposition that, even at that point, it's a gift to be alive. It's a gift to be a part of this. Makes you, well, if this is a gift, well, it makes you think about if it's a gift in that scenario. In the scenario where not only that it's just the suffering of the natural world, but on top of that, human malevolence is pretty bad. People trying to hurt you. That even at the worst possible points, that life is still a good thing. Then, where you are now, your perspective is, well, I am so far from that point that I have so much to be grateful for. Be it I have a tiny home, it's cramped, whatever, but I have a home. It might be cold outside, but I have warm clothes and warm blankets to keep me, somewhat toasty, somewhat. You know what? I had parents. Not everyone can say that. And it reminds you of all the things. It all comes back to gratitude. And that comes from just that one worldview point. Where the way I look at the world is a gift. But then if you look at the other side, the life is a curse. Then you're just going to be looking at everything as just a point of suffering. Everything is pain. And there's no redemption because life itself, no matter how good it gets, is suffering. And that's the diametrically opposite view. Because one is like, even in the worst, this is still a good thing. And the other is, even in the best, it's still a bad thing. So, wouldn't you imagine if you looked at everything as like just enough, no matter how shiny, no matter how good it felt, it would just end up in pain eventually. Those moments are fleeting, and then the rest is all suffering. Wouldn't you get bitter? Wouldn't you get lonely? Wouldn't you get angry even? Just imagine that. You know what? It's hard to say. It's hard. I don't understand why people would want to choose that, but I do understand why people come to that conclusion. Because life is hard. It is very hard for everyone, no matter what your background is. That's the initial condition. I think that's something everyone agrees on. But you see, it's not even a fact of changing reality. It's just changing something in your mind. One thought, life is a curse, makes everything worse. You see everything in a darker lens. And in the other way, it's the opposite, where you see everything in a brighter lens. You see life as a gift. So, you know what? You see the bad, but then a lot of focus comes to the good. A lot of focus comes on how things are much better than they could be. And then also, you can see how you can take that same scenario and turn it towards an even greater good. So that simple little change, just one value, one specific value, alters so much about your life. And I guess that's on another theme that's been running through every single episode that we've been discussing. Values and how much they matter in terms to how well you live your life and the happiness that ensues from it. For example, well, let's see. What's another good real life example? So what you could look at. Oh, actually, this is not my example. This is a friend's. So when he goes out on a date, he gets bored easily. So when the date's boring, it kind of is a drag for him until he made this change where it's when he's on a boring date, he just shifted in his mind to make it so that he's going to figure out why this person is so boring. And then he gets interested. He's like a puzzle for him. He's like, what is it about this person that just makes me so disinterested in them? Why are they so dejected? And then now whatever date he's on, he has a blast. And that's just a tiny perspective thing. Just a little value change, and it makes it all the better for him. So as we'll go into the next segment, we'll start discussing even more about the different types of value changes, and in the third segment, we'll go into really what the freedom of coercion is. And finally, we got to round up the 7 major ways that your worldview affects your life and happiness. Because, well, I don't think it's a subject that gets talked about. No one's told what are the right things that we should believe. There are implicit ones, but I don't think those necessarily point us the right way. So we'll get into that in the next segment, and we'll see you guys back here soon.
Are you tired of the same old news? Are you sick of the seemingly endless political spin and negativity? The GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast is a weekly news podcast covering all the top positive and uplifting news stories. We cover stories that will inspire, uplift, and remind you of the good in the world. Tune into the Golden State Media Concepts America Still Beautiful podcast to get all the great and positive news stories of today. Download the GSMC America Still Beautiful podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Welcome back to the second segment of the Life and Happiness podcast run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am today's host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into it. What are we talking about today? We're talking about worldviews and essentially how they affect our lives and happiness. It's the ways it affects the way we act, the way we see things, because they do have dramatic effects. Last segment, I finished talking about the difference between seeing life as a gift and seeing life as a curse, because those are two different worldviews, and they have diametrically opposed effects on what will you do, how do you see things around you. Seeing life as a gift, it makes you see all the good and the potential in things, versus seeing life as a curse makes you look for all the negative and only seeing how things will fall apart, emphasizing that in your mind. And I don't know about you, but I'm one to think that if you're going to if your mind's constantly affected by negative thoughts, doesn't that make you feel in a more negative manner as well? Make you move look more sullen, have a more depressed tone, all those kinds of things, versus the other way around, you might have a little bit more of a bright spot in your eyes. All that is essentially determined by one belief in your mind. And now I'm going to broaden this out to a much larger degree into ways where you may be it may be something that would shock you. So let's start with Martin Luther King Jr. The reason why I want to start with him is because in these days, he's one of the few heroes who's still universally praised. Martin Luther King Jr. across all sides. And you'll see many people on both sides of political aisles or just whatever cultural aisles look at him as he's the example to follow. And, well, let's examine. What were his worldviews? His was a message of peace, of non-violent aggression. Because the way he saw it and the way the United States is set up, the only way we could affect change in this way and do it and create a scenario which would lead to more everlasting peace between everyone was through non-violence. You make people see the error in their ways by you taking the high road. We will prove ourselves to be the best that we can in every regard, in regards of our effort, in regards of our honor, and how we treat each other. And you acting like a horrible person, being a bully, trying to force your will upon us, abusing us, will shock the minds of the people who could be on our side. It was the seeing how awful the people in charge were. That would turn the minds over to the side of those who were oppressed, because they were oppressed. And it was this Martin Luther King's aim was to take people into their highest degree, into the highest thing they could be. And I don't know if many of you knew this. We usually call him Dr. Martin Luther King, but he was also Reverend Martin Luther King. He was a pastor, and if you read his speeches, it bleeds his biblical worldview. And essentially, in his advocating for us to be the highest that we could be, it was to be the most godly we could be. Because the idea of God is the highest potential, the highest good that there is. And I'll explore that another time. But that was his worldview. That was what he stood for. And even though we may not necessarily understand his worldview, because as far as I remember, the only thing we were taught about Martin Luther King in schools is the I Have a Dream speech. But if you do your own research, all his speeches are available online. You can see all the things he believed. And some of you may be surprised. So, if this is a person that's universally acclaimed, that this is the ideal, all that is contingent upon us valuing those things as a good thing. We believe that because, well, we think honor is a good thing. We think peace is a good thing. We think moral standing is a good thing. At least I hope we do. And that's what Martin Luther King embodied. Now, let me go in the opposite direction. So, now we're going to look at what's universally hated upon, which is Adolf Hitler. Because he's the opposite example. He's the other side, at least in what could be considered our shared worldview within our own culture here in the United States. So those are opposite ends. I don't think that's a controversial statement. I think that's a thing everyone would agree on. And so anyways, so that is true for us, right? Because what did Hitler do? He led a movement based on hate. He encouraged the lower passions in everyone to victimize themselves and blame a minority, the Jewish people, as the problem of everything. He's like, everything comes out. The reason why we're low, the reason why we're not succeeding is because of that group. And he riled the hatred within people. He did things by power. He didn't, unlike Martin Luther King, he took things by force. He imposed his will on others and made massive attempts to limit the power of others to oppose him. And while we don't admire him for what he did and the horrible things which were committed under his name, that's why the word Nazi is universally seen as, well, evil person. That's what that means. That's what that word means now. When people use it, they just mean that person is an evil person. Because if anything was evil, actually evil, as far as our worldview is concerned, then the closest thing to it would be the Nazi and communist regimes of the 20th century, which, I don't know if any of you knew this, but if you add up all the deaths from the Holocaust on top of every communist regime of the last century, over 100 million people were murdered in the last century. And most people don't know this. 14 million in the Holocaust, and the rest were everywhere. I think Soviet Russia is responsible for 40 million, and I think another 40 million is from Mao Zedong, and then there's Pol Pot, and there's so much there. I would urge you to read the Black Book of Communism if you're curious about the history of the last century and all the blood that was spilled over those ideologies. Anyways, moving on back to the point. So, we see him as bad, as the nexus of what evil is. But if those people at the time in Nazi Germany saw him as a hero, saw him as the savior, and I'm sure there are people who do that today, and they saw killing Jews as a good thing, so how can people across, because they're humans too, they're not something different, they're people like you and me. So how can some people hold something that we would consider here so vile, but they would consider it as virtuous? And this is why I've emphasized so much a specific set of values, ones I do think work towards life and happiness. But those aren't the only ones, and people can disagree to the point where some people would point to Martin Luther King as the epitome of evil. Some would look to him as the worst person to ever exist. And some of those people might think Hitler is the best thing that would ever exist. And that's because their sets of values are sometimes the reverse of what we believe. Well, what we largely believe, because there is a lot of disagreement in the culture, at least in this moment, where in decades past, the same disagreements would not have been in position. So, I want you to sit on that for a little bit. Some people, because their worldview is different, because their values are different, will hold Martin Luther King as evil and Hitler as good. Whereas the normal, what our typical shared view is in this nation is that it's the reverse. Hitler was the bottom and Martin Luther King was the top. So, why is that? It's because humans are free. Humans are free to choose what we believe. And some humans will believe certain things that others won't. So, some people will say something is good when others will say something is bad. And I think in regards to society, or any group, a group requires that we have a shared worldview if we're to move in the same direction. Any group. Think about a group project. Like, hey, our goal is to get this done. All of us together, all 5 of us, we move towards that. Think about a baseball team. Our goal is to win the championship, so all 25 of us have to work together to move towards that. And then that applies to a church group or a religion. Our goal is to follow these values, to obey this god or gods, and we will move together in this direction. Or think about a nation. This is what our culture as a nation is like. This is us as a people, and we will be moving forward that way. You need that shared values, that shared worldview for any group to essentially kind of exist. And values you're not bound to a set of values by a group. Ultimately, you decide how you will act and in what manner you will act. But that's an important point to understand. And the reason why I've done all this explanation on worldviews is because we have very specific, I'm a light in that one. The principles which undergird our nation's history has a specific worldview. And it's that worldview which forms the idea of freedom from coercion. And all that is necessary to go and then explain this idea, because it is a complicated idea. And I think it's a good idea. I personally felt this as almost innately growing up. I never liked bullies. I hated seeing people when I was little just nonchalantly or blatantly trying to put what they want on top of someone else. It's the haughtiness, the arrogance, and they just make people suffer. They really do. And what are the reasons why they think so highly of themselves? Some people, and it's different per person. Some people think they have that ability because they think they're smarter than everyone else. Some people think they have that ability because they think they're cooler than everyone else. They think they're more pretty than someone else. That they think they're wealthier than someone else. They explain their worldview specifically puts them above everyone else. And I guess it resonated with me, having felt, well, one specific bully towards me, and I did not like the feeling that you get when you are bullied, that you can't do anything, that you're powerless. So, in every avenue where I could, I strove to be the person who would stop those bullies, stand up for the weak person. Like I made my friends with all the quiet and weird people that I could meet because I found them to be the most interesting, and that, well, the way I would put it is, I think it's rare that people have others that believe in them so highly. They just need that little bit of encouragement. And once you give that, there's so much more to them than you thought you could possibly imagine. Like, it's so lovely to see a person bring themselves out forward. And I only think people can do that if you're free from coercion. And the only way you can create a society with that idea is if you have protectors, people who stand against the bullies, people who enforce the rules, people hold them accountable, bring them down to the same level. And ultimately, all that is built on the worldview point that you see every single human being as equal. And the way you would describe that is equal in creation and equal before the law. And those are things we'll get into in the next segment. Now I'm going to start establishing why freedom coercion works, where it comes from, what are the worldview values which actually form it. And then we'll get into, for the last segment, 7 ways our worldview affects us. So yeah, we'll see you back in the next segment.
Tired of searching the vast jungle of podcasts? Now listen close and hear this out. There's a podcast network that covers just about everything that you've been searching. Hey! The Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network is here. Nothing less than a podcast bliss with endless hours of podcast coverage. From news, sports, music, fashion, cooking, entertainment, fantasy, football, and so much more. So stop lurking around and go straight out to the Golden State Media Concepts Podcast Network. Guaranteed to fill that podcast itch. Whatever it may be. Visit us at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Follow us on Facebook and Twitter, and download us on iTunes, SoundCloud, and Google Play.
Alright, welcome back to the Life and Happiness Podcast, run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into it. Remember, next segment we're talking about how worldview, the 7 ways worldviews affect your life and happiness. And this time we're finishing up our idea of freedom of coercion. Because, well, it's, like I've repeated before, it's complicated. It's based on lots of presuppositions that you have to agree to, which make freedom coercion actually work. And I elaborated on why worldviews are important, what they view, and how dramatically worldviews can flip. Someone could see MLK as good and Hitler as bad, and also someone could see MLK as bad and Hitler as good. And those are beliefs that humans have. And there's a question of which one's right, and that question is for another time. But now I want to get back into it. So, at the end of the last segment, I was going on about how freedom of coercion is essentially that people have a right to not be bullied. And that means I have a duty not to bully. And also, the only way you actually do make this exist in the real world is if you have people who stand up against bullies, hold bullies accountable to the same rules that everyone else is. And there are punishments for bullying other people. So that's the only way you can have freedom of coercion to exist. So what that essentially means, the rules, the law needs to be enforced equally upon everyone. That means that comes with the assumption that human beings themselves are equal in creation and equal before the law. Now, though we have that idea as commonplace now, think about the Declaration of Independence. All men are created equal. And men in that context meant all people. And if you read their extra writings, if you read the extra writings of the founders, what's his name? If I remember it, I'll mention it later in this podcast. One of the founding fathers wrote extensively about how it was a crime that at the time of the Declaration of Independence, they still had not abolished slavery, because these principles do extend to every other person, not just of the white color. And also Thomas Jefferson, in his original draft of it, did condemn slavery and essentially said the colonies were to be united in the abolition of slavery. That was the only one of the provisions which did not pass. And the agreement, the only reason it didn't is because it missed one vote to be a unanimous vote. They had, prior to the vote for it, they agreed that they had to be united before the monarchy, before the British. And every single provision in their Declaration of Independence had to be agreed upon by each colony. That was the only one which missed it, and it was incredibly close. But that's just some historical context. So now, with this idea of equal and in creation, that's an assumption going to freedom of coercion, equal for the law. What does that mean? Because people aren't equal. Think about it. Some are taller, some are smaller. Some are fatter, some are thinner, some are more athletic, some are not. I think the biggest divisions are some people are smarter than others, and some people are prettier than others. Because, having looks and intelligence goes a long way, and being ugly and stupid sucks so much. It might be one of the biggest factors into your own success in your personal life if you are missing those two. Like, there are lots of ways in which humans just vary. So it's clear that we're not equal in a biological context. No matter what type of logic you might make, there's no way that's true. So that's why we put emphasis on equal before the law. That means every human being must be held accountable to the law. In the same manner. Doesn't matter your wealth, doesn't matter your looks, doesn't matter your status, doesn't matter your geographical location. Everyone must be held accountable to the law. And the big question to that is why? Because, if I have the looks, if I have the smarts, why aren't I better than everyone else? Like, why aren't I of higher value than everyone else? Why aren't there the peons below me, And there's also the reverse, where people victimize themselves. Like, oh, I'm so lowly, I can never be like that. Therefore, I should be held to a lower standard than he is. I shouldn't be held to the same standard that that person is. Those are the two extremes. One is, I'm so much better that the rules that apply to them no longer apply to me. But there's also, I'm so horrible down here, the only way I have a chance to succeed is if the rules that apply to him don't apply to me, and they just give me benefits which he doesn't have. Those are the two extremes. And you know what? Barring what I'm going to say next, it's logical. You know? Why shouldn't we give more advantages to people that don't have advantages? In that way. And you know what? In some contexts, I think it's a good thing, where people of their own free will, of their own generosity, help out the people in need. I think that's an awesome thing. That's a thing that should be pushed. But now how that relates to the idea of equal before the law, because that goes into freedom of coercion. Because think about it. If the law is different for a way for the person that has the ability to enforce their will, why shouldn't they? If they could just bend the rules so that it benefits them and not everyone else, why shouldn't they? Why shouldn't we all do that, you know? It benefits us to make it so that the rules are better for, in my specific scenario. Why can't I do that? And this goes back to kind of, it's not, you can't explain this in a secular context. And this is why I also mentioned Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. earlier. And I'll relate this. I mentioned the founders. What unites them both, and people like David Du Bois, Frederick Douglass, Abraham Lincoln, numerous people across our history as a nation, is the specific tie to religion. Because here's a principle, and I'll contrast it to the atheistic worldview, for just to highlight the difference. A part of that belief system is that every human being is made in the image of God. And that is the part that makes them infinitely valuable. No, it doesn't matter what they look like. It doesn't matter what they sound like. If they're a human being, they have that image of God in them. And what that means is not only do they have the piece of the divine, the being which brings potential out of chaos by speech is within us, because we also do that too. But it's through that we have an understanding of right and wrong, and through that we are free to choose how we act. And because of that, each one of us is accountable for all our actions. And the reason why we're all equally accountable is because there is one law, one truth, which we all are in tune to. We can feel when we're acting in the right manner and when we're acting in the wrong manner. That's the consciousness. And because of that, we are responsible for our actions. And these are all presuppositions which results in equality before the law, equal in creation, as an equal as God created people equal. So that we have this idea of freedom from coercion, which results from all those ideas blending together to produce such a thing. And the reason why it's extremely hard to come to the same conclusion from an atheistic worldview is, well, where do your rights come from? Because the other one says they're divine in nature. They're bestowed by something beyond this world and will be enforced once we leave this world. But an atheistic worldview removes all of that. There's only this world. There's only matter, only what we can see, feel, and touch, right? So, we're all made out of the same things. Atoms. Every single one of us. So, now the question is, why would humans be infinitely valuable? why would humans be any more valuable than a rock? We're made out of the same stuff. We're literally made out of the same stuff. Carbon, hydrogen, oxygen, silicon, all this kind of things. That rocks have that, we have that. Cats have that, we have that. Trees have that, we have that. Stars have that, we have that. So, okay. So we're all made out of the same stuff. That kind of, if we're going to hold things in equally valuable, that means a human is just as valuable as a rock, which is just as valuable as a book, which is just as valuable as a cat, because they're all made out of the same material, right? But then the question is, if we want to hold that humans are infinitely valuable, and therefore only humans are bound by the same laws, then how do you explain that? Why is specifically the combination of atoms which results in humans more valuable than a combination of atoms which results in dogs? Or if you want to... So there's no great way to separate out humans from everything else. And then comes this idea, well, if you want to hold things equal for the law, well, why don't we follow the law of animals? Or the law of rocks, whatever it is. For example, like, how do you defend, like, why can't humans go around naked just casually? Animals do it all the time. Why is there a need to act that way? Why do we have a law for ourselves that is separate than that of animals? And you can't really explain that. And I've also gone to other worldviews, the Buddhist worldview and Hindu worldview, to talk about more about, because they also have this idea where they want to hold humans and animals roughly before the same kind of law, the karmic system. And it's also more like an arbitrary choice of why we choose humans as the pinnacle, or some people just level them all out to the same playing field, and you can't really explain it. It's more like we take these assumptions in, like, oh, it's obvious that every human is equal and that humans should act different than animals, but we don't understand why. Because if you try to take a purely scientific route to try to explain something like that, you can't. Like, let's see. I remember there was a story several months back where the reason why I mentioned the public nudity issue, because they did have a vote in San Francisco whether to allow public nudity, and it came down, I think, to two votes. Two votes held that it didn't pass, but the reasons that they came up for it was unsanitary. That, well, you sit down and someone doesn't, and then someone else will sit down on, well, where your butt was. But if you want to solve that, then the next bill could come by and be like, okay, public nudity is allowed, but you have to bring a towel around and you sit on your towel every time you sit on a place. So that way you solve the cleanliness issue. But the arguments against public nudity weren't any more... They didn't strike a chord deeper than that. They're like, oh, it's just unsanitary. Which, it's true. But that's also not the strongest reasoning for it. That's my point here is to say that freedom coercion I think is a good idea. I think it's a great idea that you should be able to stand tall from bullies. But it's based on lots of assumptions, let's say. Lots of things you'd have to incorporate into your worldview that largely don't hold if you adopt a different worldview. Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King and the founders agreed to the same ideas because they had the same foundational principles in which formed the way they looked at the world. And if you read their writings, it's extremely clear. Like, oh, I would love to do this. Maybe I'll do this another time. Maybe I'll do some episodes exploring great great writers and show what they have. I have the original draft of the Declaration of Independence, and I can read that aloud so you can see what Thomas Jefferson was saying about how much of an evil slavery was, and how every time they tried to stop it, the crown would just reinstate it and quash every effort. And it's an amazing read, and I would love to do that out loud for you all. But yeah, that was my whole spiel on trying to get to why Freedom Coercion exists, because it's based on deeper things. And, well, what worldviews do for your lens of, for how you act, how you view things, what makes something right and makes something wrong. And, well, some worldviews, we kind of adopt certain ideas because they're around in the culture, but those same worldviews don't have a good explanation for those ideas. But anyways, put your thoughts in the comments below. I really want to hear what you all think. That took a lot of time to kind of get into the best way where I could explain it, where instead of going down lots of larger rabbit holes, which all these ideas essentially come from. But yeah, we're going to go into the next segment, 7 ways that worldviews affect you, your life, and your happiness. And come on, we'll see you in the next one.
The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast, the show that gives you advice on everything travel. We explore places you've always wanted to go, as well as giving tips for traveling in those places. We'll give you advice on the best sites for travel tips, information, and discounts. Join us as we travel the world, explore cultures, and meet new people. The Golden State Media Concepts Travel Podcast has got you covered. Download the GSMC Travel Podcast on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type GSMC in the search bar.
Hello and welcome back to the final segment of today's episode of the Life and Happiness Podcast, run by the GSMC Podcast Network. I am your host, Steven Solorzano, and let's get back into this. So this final segment, we're going to be talking about the 7 ways worldviews affects your life and happiness. And let's start off with number 1, your mood. It's obvious. Let's say you start off by, like we already discussed this a little bit before. You think you focus on what you have to be grateful for, the things which make your life better. You're going to start off more cheery if you keep that in your mind from the morning and keep that up every single day. It will carry you through. It will give you extra strength when things get bad. It'll let you brush off the inconveniences of the day. Because you know what? Inconveniences happen. But if you keep that focus on what you're grateful for, then, you know, your mood will perk up. Now, think about it a different way. Let's think about it, let's say, a simple one, I'll get a little bit more into this. Let's say you believe you have value. That will carry you through, even though there are scenarios which you know what? Test that belief. Make you feel powerless, make you feel kind of worthless. It's those tiny little things in your head affect dramatically how we see the things around us. The same instance, let's say someone giving you, actually, here's a personal story about this. So I was walking to the park one day to go practice some baseball, and I had my gear with me, and I went to go make a right, but when I looked at the street, I realized there was no sidewalk, and I got annoyed, just mildly inconvenienced. And I looked to the left, and I guess I still had that annoyance on my face. And right as I looked to the left, there was this guy on his bike who was right there, and he thought I was giving him a nasty look. And he stopped his bike, got pissed, and tried to start a fight with me. And I was surprised. I was like, I didn't know he was there. The emotion on my face went off. I was like, and it was just Me telling him, you know what, I did not do that. I wasn't looking at you that way. I'm sorry that you thought that. But that wasn't the case. And he was getting all upset. He had it. I don't know what was bothering him, but something in his mind made it so him seeing that triggered him so much to stop his day and try to start a fight. But I had my baseball bat with me, and he looked at me, looked at the bat, looked how earnest I was being, and then, decided to back off. He actually did come find me later on my way to the park, and he apologized for how he acted. And he said that he's been going through a lot of bad things, and his mood was affected by having these kind of negative thoughts in his head, and it just triggered that. So that's the way your worldview, your thought process, your beliefs can affect you. So number 2, your habits. So let's see. How do I put this one? Your habits are formed by the things you feel obligated to do. For example, and for me, I feel obligated to be the best person I can be in every scenario, as kind as I can be, as generous, whatever that might be. So part of what goes on my mind is I make sure I open doors for people, say hi. I always try to open up a little bit, when I meet people, try to pull a little bit more out of them. I go out of my way for my friends, and it's because deep in me, I feel like I have this obligation to provide the best I can to people. I'm duty bound to do so. And for me, part of that is a religious context. I feel I'm accountable to something higher than myself. But I know many other people who, because they don't feel accountable to anything, they just act with disrespect towards things. It's not that they want to be bad. It's they don't feel the pressure that they should act in a certain manner, so they don't. It's just not a thing. It's not like, oh, they're seeking to do wrong. It's not in their mind. It's just never happened. Like, not a thought like that occurred. And those habits don't form. Or think about it this way. Like, let's say, I'm going to use Islam as an example. Part of Islam is the 5 prayers a day, and at certain times. So that forms a habit of them repeating that behavior over and over. So they do it 5 times a day. And I think it's also oriented towards Mecca. And those are the part of their worldview, and it forms part of the way they act, the habits that they keep. And more broadly, it's how your parents raised you, or at least what are the values that formed you when you were young. And that informs many things you will do as you're older. And sometimes in ways, it's not even values you necessarily understand that you believe, but that you've learned to act that way implicitly, even with it. For example, like, what would be a good example of that? Oh, actually, this is a funny story. In a lot of Latino circles, it's common for belts to be used to punish kids, and specifically leather belts, and they have a very specific sound. And me joking around with a friend in high school, we took off our belts and we made the sound. And another one of our Latino friends, off the way, he jumped because his mind associates that sound with the belt. So you know what? He sees it, he freaks out. It's a habit. It's internal. And it's something that he came to recognize and act that way. Now, number 3, your relationships. That's another one which is affected by your worldview. Because, as we mentioned, it affects your habits, so your worldview affects your actions too. Actually, I'm going to go mention Dennis Prager's example of honor thy mother and father. He believed God obligated him to do so. So, even when he was angry, upset, and not happy with his parents in his early 20s, as many people go through, he made sure to call them both every week since then, and has been doing so ever since he left the house at 21. No matter what the situation is, he always gives them a call once a week. And that's because, well, his worldview incorporates that he's obligated to do so. And that's specific to your relationship with your parents. But think about it this way. Okay. Think about a man's perspective, where it's either you're obligated to treat a woman well and marry them for the goal of she's going to be the mother of your child and to rear a family together, or the view that women are just there for sex. Those are two different worldviews. And that also changes how you treat them. One's going to treat them rude and going to have everything oriented in a way to get into the bed. And the other one is going to be treated with respect, because there's a different perspective on how men should treat women. And that is affecting those relationships. That's one. So we talk about first love type relationships, and then or just between the sexes type relationship, and then also between the parents, and then how about also treating friends? Let's say your worldview is one where you see yourself above everyone else versus you see yourself as someone who is on the same level. Everyone is equal. One is conducive to producing bullies, and the other one is conducive to producing actual bonding relationships where one person gives his best to someone else as the other might do for him. But likelihood, I've also found that people tend to gather towards people that share the same values. So if you act in that manner, which it tends towards better relationships, you'll tend to find yourself in circles where you'll have more of those better relationships. That's another thing about that. You just get around the same type of people. And number 4 is success. Actually, 4 and 5 are basically kind of the same kind of thing. It's success and the goals that you aim for. Let's say that your worldview is shaped by the idea that monetary success is the only type of success which matters. So you'll aim single-mindedly towards that. And then how about another one? Your worldview where being this is against more goals, but your goal, your highest goal is to be a good father, to have a family, that kind of thing. You'll be aiming towards those kind of actions. But then all of it is determined by your work ethic, those types of values, of how much you feel obligated that you need to put your own effort out there. Because if your worldview is one where you victimize yourself, it's everyone else's responsibility, it's not yours, you're not going to put in the effort which is required to get there. You're not even putting it as your own duty, your own obligation, versus someone is saying, I need to put everything I can to maximize whatever I can do. It doesn't matter what the goal is. They're going to orient themselves towards that, orient themselves to the best way to achieve that. And as they move along the path, they'll fix whatever things they're doing wrong to keep getting towards that goal. And that comes a lot from us. And whatever goals that we do choose, it's also going to affect how we act towards other people. Because, well, if your worldview is one where, again, it's a success, but any means possible, sometimes any means possible is doing some nasty things, versus aiming to be a good father. That's a very specific set of actions you would take. That's, well, protecting your family, being there for the moments that are necessary, being good to your wife, and all these other things, which is a completely different type of person than is the other one. And that's shaped by your worldview. And then number 6, and I think these next two are probably the most important ones of the lot. Your resolve. Things get hard. We've talked about that so many times. Things get really hard. What are you going to do when they're at their worst? What are you going to do when everyone is against you? When it's just you against the world? Not everyone can handle that. I don't think most or hardly anyone could handle that. But that's the worst situation. And there's a lot of gradation from where we are now and then. But your beliefs about yourself and about what the right thing is are going to guide you through that. The only thing which I could think could make someone strong enough to handle fighting against everyone they know and trust on top of the society at large. Think about the family trying to save the Anne Frank's family back in the Holocaust. Think about that example. When they know that moving forward on this path is literally the hardest path because every other human being is opposed to them, at least in their direct vicinity. The only way you can have the strength to do so is if you single-mindedly believe that you're doing the right thing. And that can be the source of strength, which pushes you through those hard situations. And ultimately, I think the best way to achieve that, to get that the most consistently, is to be fighting for the truth. Because if you know what's actually true, what is real, that's one thing that you don't have to doubt anymore. And it's one thing that you know if you stick to will always be true. Like 2 + 2 = 4. But that resolve is largely determined by your beliefs about yourself, your obligations, and what you view as reality. Because if you don't know what to believe, then why wouldn't you just go along with everyone else? And sometimes people do. But the thing is, sometimes everyone else wants to do some pretty bad things. And there are many examples of that in the world. So, resolve is important. It's one of the, you can't do everything alone. That's hard to wish, I wouldn't wish that on anyone. But sometimes you're in that scenario. So who are you going to be when you get there? That's an important question to kind of consider. And the last one, the last way that your worldview affects your life and happiness is through meaning. Think about it. What if your worldview says everything is meaningless? You're never going to find meaning. You're just going to be in that hole, like spinning forever until something shakes you out of that worldview. Versus if you hold that life does have meaning and you just haven't found it yet, but you will, you're more likely to not be in that hole, which is spinning around aimless and honestly in pain. When you don't feel like you're doing the right thing, when you feel like nothing matters, and then you also believe that nothing matters, you're just putting yourself in a positive feedback cycle for a negative thing. You're just making everything worse. It's like setting yourself on fire. It's just bad. But that's something which comes down to what you believe about the world. And I sincerely do hope that all of you can find meaning out there, because it's one of the greatest things to feel. I'm sure some of you know this moment, to feel that you're in the right place at the right time and everything just works. Everything is worth it. That's what people should aim for. And I do think that's along the path of truth, but it's like building upon all the other ideas that we've talked about. So, yeah, those are the 7 ways that your worldview will affect how you live your life and how your happiness is, how you find your happiness. We'll see what we talk about in the next video. I really do want to hear your thoughts on all this. Comment below wherever you're listening. Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube. Don't forget to like, favorite, subscribe, share with the world. Let people know these ideas. Let's have this conversation keep going. And we'll see you all in the next episode. This is Steven Solorzano, signing off.
You've been listening to the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast, part of the GSMC Podcast Network. You can find the show and others like it at www.gsmcpodcast.com. Download our podcasts on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Google Play, or anywhere you find podcasts. Just type in GSMC to find all of our shows. From the GSMC Podcast Network, from sex and relationships to health and wellness, life and happiness, and even weird news. You can also follow us on Twitter and Facebook. Thank you, and we hope you have enjoyed today's episode of the Golden State Media Concepts Life and Happiness Podcast.